Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, Student Perspectives Panels, which is the inaugural webinar in the Social Justice Pedagogy series. This event is being recorded, and this series is being jointly developed by ASPA's section on Democracy and Social Justice, or DSJ, ASPA's section on Public Administration Education, or SPAE, and NASPA's Committee on Diversity and Social Equity. My name is Sean, and I serve as chair of DSJ. I'm going to be remaining off camera for the duration of this event, which not only helps with bandwidth issues, but also makes editing the video easier. We ask that anyone who's not presenting to turn off their cameras to help with bandwidth. And we're also pleased to be joined today by Prisa Vincent, who's DSJ's absolutely fantastic digital engagement coordinator, as well as Dr. Stephanie Dollimore, who is the incoming chair of SPAE. And we'll be having a couple other members of the planning committee pop in eventually, just a little bit later. But before we get started with the event today, we'd like to invite all of you to another webinar. On February 4th, ASPA DSJ will hold a discussion examining the causes and effects of the recent insurrection at the US Capitol building. We'll be featuring these four amazing panelists, and we'll be discussing the causes and effects of the insurrection, roles played by racism and white supremacy in the insurrection, actions of law enforcement before, during, and after, effects on democratic norms, values, and processes, and a lot more. We're going to be sharing the RSVP link with you shortly. We hope you will be able to attend. So let's just go ahead and get started with our webinar today. As I mentioned, this is the inaugural webinar in a series jointly developed by DSJ-SPAE and NASPA DEI and Social Justice Pedagogy. Throughout the year, we're going to be offering webinars and workshops on how to integrate social justice into curricula, crafting assignments, facilitating difficult conversations, engaging in social justice focused data analyses, and a lot more. And when planning this series, we unanimously agreed that we wanted to start the series by having a student perspectives panels, especially to focus on student perspectives on how social justice can and should be modeled and taught in the classroom, strategies, next steps, and so forth. Because student perspectives are, quite frankly, invaluable. And we hope the discussion and feedback here can help all programs center social justice throughout curricula and adopt practices to ensure that all students in public administration, public policy, and public affairs are aware of and competent in social justice perspectives and actions. So we're honored to be joined today by 5 amazing panelists featuring both MPA candidates and doctoral candidates from across numerous programs. So please help me in welcoming our 5 amazing panelists. We have Meril Antony of Rutgers University, Newark, and if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name, please let me know. You have Eunique Avery of the University of Cincinnati, Stephanie Puello of the University of Colorado, Denver, Abdul of Florida International University, and Heather Sobrepena of the University of Montana. In terms of logistics, we worked with our panelists to develop some opening discussion questions. We're going to discuss these questions one at a time in a round robin style, and please feel free to answer whatever order you want, follow up on responses, ask questions, and so forth. We really want this to be a dynamic, engaging conversation. And then after opening questions, we're going to open the floor to audience Q&A. And so with that, I am going to stop my screen share so we can see our panelists. And let's go ahead and get started with the first question. And again, just please answer in whatever order you would like. So here is our first question to our panelists. So just tell us a little bit about yourself and your interests in social justice. And Abdul, you're on the screen, so you want to just go ahead and go first?
Absolutely. Let's do that. Well, thank you very much, Sean. First of all, I would like to give a big shout out to Sean for putting this wonderful panel together, and thank everyone for joining us here. As Sean mentioned before, my name is Abdul. I am a doctoral student in the Department of Public Policy and Administration at Florida International University. My dissertation focuses on the participation of marginalized groups in the US local governments. Looking at the enabling and hindering factors and what are the sources of their marginalization when it comes to public participation. I'm currently serving as the student representative in the National Council of the American Society for Public Administration. Looking forward to more questions and hearing from the rest of the panelists.
Awesome, thank you.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. Go ahead, jump right on in.
All right. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you, Sean, and thank you for all the sections for organizing this event and for bringing all of us together for this very important discussion. I'm a 4th-year doctoral candidate at the School of Public Affairs and Administration at Rutgers University in Newark. My research interest focuses on the school parent interlinkages, where I'm looking at school as a public service organization, as an institution in itself, and how, and using a public administration framework, the co-production theory, to better understand these school parent interlinkages, but also to understand the contextual factors like presence of social or cultural capital, or whether you're belonging to a majority race. How does those actually moderate some of these co-production mechanisms, and then its subsequent effects on student outcomes. In terms of my background, I'm an Indian citizen. I came to US for my MPA program, which I again did at Rutgers Department of Public Affairs. And then I continued into their PhD program. In terms of my interest with respect to social justice, I think one is definitely around the context of marginalization within the schools, but also to understand what are the commonplace education practices that actually enhance the inequity by not including a lot of the minority group parents as effectively as, let's say, the others. And secondly, with respect to, since I have been in the MPA program, in the US MPA program, and now I'm in the PhD program, I think looking at the curriculum and differentiating the curriculum between the two, there is a lot of discussion around social justice and some of the concepts of equity and diversity in the MPA program, but not more from a critical analysis or a critical interpretation by looking at a more seminal works, which is much more advanced, I think, in a PhD seminar classes. So I think those two are my main reasons for interest in social justice.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Eunique, would you, since you and Meril were kind of almost tied for unmuting yourselves, would you like to go next?
Yes, definitely. Hello, everybody. My name is Eunique Avery, and I currently attend the University of Cincinnati, where I am in the Master's of Public Administration program with a social justice focus. I am a first-generation college graduate, and hopefully I'm going to keep that going and pursue my doctorate degree at some point. And my interest in social justice would probably be just about every topic there is, but some of the ones that I hold near and dear to my heart would be K through 12 public education, food insecurity, and basically all areas of systemic racism. And I'm excited to be here, so thank you for having me.
Thank you.
I'll go next. And I also want to thank Sean and everyone that's been part of putting this together, and also for inviting me. It's definitely a privilege to be here today. And I also just want to appreciate a lot of the faculty that are here. Essentially with your participation, you're conveying that there's something to learn from students. And I think that that's really important. And I also really appreciate that. So my name is Stephanie Puello, and I'm a third-year PhD student at CU Denver in public affairs. I'm currently studying the relationship between felony disenfranchisement policies, civic engagement, and election administration. And for me, when it comes to social justice, it feels less of an interest and more of a commitment and a responsibility. And the questions that I pose are really try to engage with and address historically rooted dynamics of oppression. For me, I think that injustice, any injustice that we see or experience is both a policy failure and a policy choice. And I think that I just generally want to be part of promoting and advancing social justice and equity, both in research and practice.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, my name is Heather Sobrepena, and I'll go ahead and round out this first question. So I'm a recent graduate of the MPA program at the University of Montana in Missoula, which is the ancestral homeland of the Salish and Kootenai tribes, as well as an area, a valley that several different tribal nations traveled through when they were on their journey to hunt buffalo out in the plains of eastern Montana and into North and South Dakota. So that is the location of my school. I am an enrolled member of the Cheyenne Sioux tribe in South Dakota as part of the Lakota Nation, and I'm also a Crow descendant or a Seneca Nation in Montana. And, you know, to give homage to my dad, I'm a second generation Filipino American. His dad emigrated through San Francisco to California, or to the United States. So a little bit about myself. I am a program manager on the policy team for the Center for Indian Country Development at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, where I just recently started this last summer after several years with the state of Montana, overseeing all of our tribal business and economic development programs. So I think it's important just to bring to the conversation that I think that MPA programs are really, at least my experience is that they are intended to sort of capture these mid-career professionals. So, you know, I already had a good job, and I was representative and, you know, of the Native American culture and Native American population within the inner workings of state organization. But, you know, I think the MPA programs are really intended to help elevate and boost not only the pedagogy of public administration, but as well as the opportunity. Like, where do we find ourselves within the opportunity of our careers? And so I would say that my interest in social justice is really out of self-interest, which is weird to say from a Lakota perspective, but maybe it's just my experience as an example of what gives social justice context. So, you know, when I think about social justice, it's the distribution of wealth, opportunity, and privilege within a society. And that is the work that I do at the bank. So I'm working on providing content, policy content, engagement and outreach opportunities to address structural and financial inclusion challenges for tribal nations and tribal members who, as we know, are not fully participating in the economy. And I would say that personally, you know, active social justice for me is really representing for my children, for my DSJ-SPAE, for my elders and ancestors who are watching me, to bring social justice and representativeness of the Lakota experience into the larger world of public administration and representation where decisions are being made at the table. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, these are just, you know, fantastic, fantastic introductions. And you can see we have a, you know, absolutely a fantastic panel. And this leads nicely into our next question. And it's going to be taking us a little bit from about yourselves and your interest in social justice, and really get your everyone's assessments about the current state of social justice in the current PA community. So what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be sharing the question I'm going to be asking. I'm in the chat so everyone can see. So I'll just go ahead and read it out. For our panelists, and in your assessment, what do you think is the current state of social justice in the PA academic community? And nice intentionally broad, so that way you could approach it however you see fit.
Am I going first again?
Looks like you are, sir.
All right. Sounds good. I think this is a big challenge when I talk about myself. I think it starts with kind of have had a hard time explaining the discipline to someone who's not familiar with what PA is. You're doing a public administration, you're doing an MPA, or I'm doing a doctoral, you know, degree in public administration or public affairs. So what do you do exactly? You know, public service entails so many different areas. So I think when it comes to my assessment of where we're heading as a field, when I started my PhD program, and this was a conversation that I would have with a lot of colleagues, not in my university, but other universities as well, that the scope of PA is kind of getting narrower. We are more focused on smaller questions and kind of hesitant to the broader questions that entails a society as a whole. And I also kind of felt this in terms of, you know, my dissertation focus is on, let's say, social equity. I'm looking at a particular race ethnicity, or let's say immigrants or something. And the next question comes to my mind is that going to get me a job when I graduate with a PhD? Is that going to be a welcoming sign in other universities or among the scholars? Not to undermine what some of the great scholars are doing when it comes to social justice, race, and social equity. So I think these were the things. But again, when you talk to your mentors, get different perspectives, it gives you motivation. What you're doing is meaningful, and it has value, and it will be valued. But these were some of the starting, I would say, concerns I had when it comes to my assessment of the field. But when it comes to the future, I think we're here to stay, and the scope is bright. I think that's what we have been asking to our professors, chairs in different departments. So I'm hopeful that we're going to do great things and also combine different perspectives. But at the same time, there are some challenging concerns in my mind that when was the next time we saw some of the PA scholars on the news, or talking about important policy implications. So I hope to see that more, and I look forward to hear other perspective and hopefully give more insights on that.
Thank you. Great points.
I can go next. I think I sort of agree and disagree with Abdul a little bit. I think I agree that there has been a lot of research done around social justice, around the concepts of social equity and diversity. But I feel like over the years, the PA academic community has really grown in terms of what these definitions mean, or how are they trying to incorporate, whether it's at a university level, whether it's in an MPA program and in a PhD program. I think where it differentiates is the scholars who are doing the work, who are doing amazing work. There is still, I think it's still limited in terms of scholars coming who are scholars, women of color or international scholars, whether they are bringing different social justice perspectives. I, being from India, have a very different perspective of social justice. I will be able to draw some parallels from both an Indian context and a US context. And I think we have a lot of scholars who are immigrants who have come here. And I think it's important that their viewpoints are also like addressed and also sort of put forward. I think that is one aspect which is missing when we discuss or define social justice, or define the different tenets of social justice. And I think, secondly, this is again based on my experience with Rutgers University and with my department. I think over the last few years, there has been a lot of work, there has been a lot of footwork that has been put in with respect to bringing about awareness around social justice, whether it's in the form of diversity training or sensitivity training, whether it's about having these tough conversations about biases or microaggressions in classrooms. So I feel like the needle is slowly shifting, but yes, it's a very slow shift. But overall, I think that at a scholarly level, a lot of research is being done. I think it's more about how it can be more mainstreamed and incorporated into the curriculum and into some of the programs, both whether it's MPA, undergrad, or the PhD program.
Excellent. Excellent.
I can definitely echo a lot of those statements that were already shared. I do agree that on one end, social justice, the topic in general, is kind of still in this like stagnant space, but then however, there still has been an increase in conversation, an increase in research. And so I do agree on both of those points. For me personally, in my own personal PA community within my program, it's been pretty refreshing because the program is based off a social justice focus or framework. So for me, it's been just a little bit different. So we talk about social justice all the time in the text, the required text that we read. There's always like an intentional conversation happening. And just for me, identifying as an African-American woman, I'm able to share with my classmates and be completely transparent and be real about a lot of those uneasy conversations that in other spaces I feel like I would have to mute myself. And so I think because I have experienced this program and it has been very refreshing for me that I do have a different lens. I definitely think in terms of the university as a whole, there's still more work to be done in terms of really getting beyond that surface level conversation about social justice topics, but I can definitely agree that we are off to a great start. So.
Excellent, thank you.
I can go next. I think I mostly agree with a little bit of the ambivalence of the previous responses. I think that when it comes to social justice in PA, I think it's still in its nascency, which in saying that out loud kind of feels a little negligent and irresponsible. I think the interest is certainly growing. People are paying more attention to these things and becoming, I think, a little bit more conversant with these ideas of social and racial justice. But I do think that the conversations are still a little lacking and fragmented. I feel like the conversations aren't always complemented with like systematic critique. I think we're more comfortable talking about the numbers and pointing to them to demonstrate that there is inequality, but we don't always go beyond that. I don't think we're necessarily always interrogating like the infrastructure that allows and sustains that inequality, at least within PA. And I also agree that I don't think there's enough scholars of color or international scholars or those exploring, non-Western PA and different traditions. So kind of to Abdul's point, I feel like that salience in social justice isn't necessarily being like complemented with more research funding or an appreciation or acknowledgement of this work, despite the fact that there are definitely scholars out there. There's the subset of scholars, whose research agendas are fully informed by their commitment to social justice. But I just think that it can't just be that designated few. I think that we really need to infuse social justice into everything that we study and teach. And whether it's, environmental policy, or if you're a behavioral economist or you're teaching about budgeting, I think we need to be talking about the implications for social justice. It's not just for those scholars researching race, it's for everyone that's studying the public realm and public institutions. So I think that we are far from being on the precipice of like a real paradigm shift in our field, but I vacillate. And I'd say that I'm cautiously optimistic of the prospects for social justice and like truly becoming more embedded into our discipline.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I would say as a recent graduate, I graduated in December in the MPA program, and I feel like while the nation was going through an identity crisis of, who are we and what are the tenets upon which our country is based and how has that changed over time, I think a real sort of self-actualization of our country that we're going through right now is reflective, was reflective in the classroom conversations that we had. And I think that public administration as a theory and a practice is going through I think, we are in that policy window and in that decision-making reflection process where, this is the time in our country is the time and place where we have a policy window to create some radical shifts in how public administration is taught and what we think about, in terms of the sort of empirical theory and basis for what public administration is. I would say, I have a couple of heroes within public administration scholarship. John Rawls' theory of justice, especially as it relates to public administration and actually realizing social justice and equity and equality. I would say, 2028 is too far off for the Middlebrook 4 conference, where we had a lot of really great foundational thought about what public administration should try to accomplish or what the bureaucracy should try to accomplish. And I think, my if I had to pick a favorite, Rosemary O'Leary has just been this sentinel of thought in terms of incorporating new scholars as change agents, incorporating new work into the pedagogy of public administration, new research methods, as well as paying more attention to our methods of research to be able to reflect not just sort of this quantitative proof data that validates or verifies that something is true, but also having more of an emphasis on the qualitative, like in the Lakota way, there are ways of knowing. And rather than coming into my community and researching what our methods of civic engagement are and looking at a chart and a graph of numbers, it's really more about our ways of knowing and not questioning that. Like, it just is what it is. And we don't, I think within the field of public administration and within all sciences, we're always looking for that proof, for that data that validates that something is true. And I think we really need to shift our thinking in public administration, particularly in research areas of public administration, that there are just ways of knowing that need to become more streamlined within public administration practice and scholarship. And then I would just say, personally, I think that and we're finding this at the center, that there really is a dearth of Indigenous-led research in the space of public administration. And when I say Indigenous, I'm speaking from a Lakota perspective, or tribal nations, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians. But I would say that statement could be true for many communities of color across the globe, that there needs to be more really Indigenous-led research within this space, and that this application of the Western concept of proof really needs to shift. So, and also that public administration needs to make space for that. It needs to make space, not just for that conversation, but for, how we peer review articles, or how we reflect and champion that within our public discourse.
Mm-hmm. These were really powerful responses. Anyone want to follow up?
Just to piggyback on what Heather just mentioned, I think that resonates with what I wanted to say about the field getting narrower. Like, there are some programs across the country, or maybe international, we see highly quantitative focused, some highly qualitative focused. There's a lot of focus on, is this concept measurable? How are you going to operationalize this concept? And in this spirit, a lot of important questions, they are not either research or, there's lack of motivation to answer those. And then just a follow-up question that I was thinking. So we talk about, and this is for the panelists and anyone else who wants to join in.
Excellent.
That I was thinking, and I thought I would ask here, is when we talk about public service and social justice, do you see public service, social justice compatible, or as like separate entities?
Great question. Thank you for asking that. So, panelists, any thoughts on that? Great question.
Sean, can you read?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, can you restate the question? Sorry, I see I'm having some connectivity issues.
Sure. Well, I was just asking, we were just talking about public service and social justice. So do you guys see social justice, public service compatible, or as separate entities? Not trying to put you guys on the tough spot, but this is just, I was trying to build a point here. It's like, I think we should be able to view it as, interconnected, following up with the coming up questions. But go ahead, Meril.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree that they should be interconnected, but in my experience, they are not. I can just give you an example. I have taught an undergrad course on public service organizations, which is a very introductory course on what are public service organizations, how do they work, just some of the basic fundamental principles around it. And I think, and also and there are other courses in the undergrad program which really go deeper into some of the public service motivations and values. But I think one place which I think even I have been limited on is how do you analyze whether social justice is prevalent in a certain public service organizations, or how do you analyze how much diversity in an organization is good, or how do you analyze whether the organization has been culturally competent. And I think there are different tools. There are amazing work that is being done. There is the diversity and inclusion framework, but I think the works that are being done are still done in silos. I think in order for you to interconnect public service to social justice, it needs to be more mainstreamed, where you have, and I'm not talking about quantitative rigor, but in just general, like Heather mentioned, the different methodologies that surround us in understanding social justice. Like, how can you then link it back at an organization? Because if we are talking from an MPA program perspective, these are students, or these are already mid-service professionals who would be going back to their jobs, or who would be becoming public servants, or working with the government or nonprofit sector. So I think it's important for them to not just look at the organization as a public service organization, or how much of a public service organization, but also to understand that as a public service organization, are they doing enough to incorporate some of the social justice value? Are they doing enough to ensure that there is diversity within an organization? So what kind of tools can we give as a PA academic community? And I know there is incredible research that is being done. And just as a simple example would be, I had one of the assignments where they had to shadow one of the leaders of the organization, so someone who's at a managerial level or at a higher level, and then try and do a SWOT analysis to try and understand what are some of the strengths, the weaknesses of a public service organization. But it would be more interesting and important to also incorporate how would you define social equity. So trying to understand what different perspectives, individual perspectives, would also come up front would be very important and relevant today.
Excellent, excellent. Any other comments on that? This is a great conversation.
I was going to say I definitely would agree that it should be hand in hand or intersected together, but definitely I would personally say as of right now it is not. I would definitely have to definitely agree that organizations need to identify what social justice or social equity means to them in that space, in the space that they work in. And I was just going to say, I was actually just reading about this for another class, that a lot of the environmental factors influence a lot of the public sectors or public agencies. And I know funding is a huge component. So we need to be able to be in a space where we're not afraid that we're going to lose funding if we take a certain stance on a social equity issue. And I think that is something that really impacts the public sector a lot more than, of course, private. And I'm sure nonprofit deals with this issue as well. But I just think that funding has a huge impact on how comfortable people are with stepping out there and doing what they know that they need to do.
Yeah, and I would just add that, yeah, so like Meril and Eunique, I definitely agree that I think it, it depends on the question, in a very normative sense. I think it ought to be, inextricably linked, because really that's the way that I see it. And the moment that Abdul, when you asked that question, it seemed like an obvious answer in my head of like, yes, but then I kind of sat back and thought about it, that it's difficult for that to happen, I think, in practice, because really what needs to happen is, I think it's a larger interrogation of like, our values as a society. Because I think at the individual level, like a lot of people can be driven by these imperatives of serving the public and things of that sort, but there are so many barriers to be able to act on that, particularly if you don't have the discretion to, depending on your role and things like that. But also just the way that we form our institutions and the historical context of our institutions and who, you know, they are supposed to serve, or you know, the kind of perverse incentives to not serve, you know, people equitably. So I think that ultimately we would really have to see, you know, the extent to which we are like truly committed to social justice and equity, and if that informs like our actual practices, or if it's just more of, you know, is it more means testing? Is it more just kind of putting a Band-Aid on some of these issues? Is it more, you know, allowing people to just, you know, adopting this individualist framework that we have in the US and just kind of allowing people to figure it out on their own? I think that only if we were to systematically change or adopt different values, would we be able to actually change, you know, how we serve people, and how social justice, the larger movement for social justice is really informed by or linked with public service.
Great comments, great comments. And I'd just like to and Eunique has a great comment in the chat. We saw this in real time when the past administration wanted to defund public education and workspaces, as discussed white supremacy and systemic racism. And you see, and this is exactly why this this panel is just so absolutely needed, and is that from the perspective of the people who created this panel, is that there cannot be a conception of public service without a social justice component about it. It cannot exist. And what I'd like to share with everyone before we go into our next question, because I just think it's essential, is I'm going to be sharing with you a link to the NASPA Subcommittee on Fostering Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion report. So you can go ahead and click on it there. The public comment period ended on this just a couple days ago. So I'm hoping that you did get a chance to comment on it. But, you know, even if you didn't get a chance to comment on it, there's still a lot of opportunities to do this. And I think there's just a couple things that are so important about why this panel is so important. I mean, look at the first paragraph. His task force was initiated in response to the killing of George Floyd and a desire for NASPA to move towards intentional actions to become a model for member institutions in the fight against anti-Black racism, discrimination, and inequity. And you can read through this report about the various types of suggestions across numerous levels for programs, for individual classes, field and beyond, about why this is so absolutely important and why it's so important to keep the discussion on these particular topics going, and not just discussion, but action in it. And so this whole series is going to be discussions about ways in which we can hopefully do that, individual classes and programmatic levels and so forth. So this was a fantastic discussion. And what I'd just like to remind everyone in the audience is that we already got some great questions and comments, and looks like everyone who's asked a question so far has asked us to ask it on everyone's behalf, and we're going to do that towards the end. But again, if you have a question or a comment, please use this form right here. We do have a question on there asking if you'd like to ask it directly, and that's fine. So let's go ahead and get going with our third question, and I'm going to go ahead and post it in the chat here. And this nicely builds off these last questions, and it gets into, you know, what can we do? And in your assessment, what needs to be done to foster greater awareness of and action on social justice, especially from a pedagogical perspective? But it doesn't even have to be from a pedagogical perspective. It could be anything implicating PA programs and beyond. Sorry, that was a very long lead in by me, but I got a little passionate about that topic, so I apologize.
Sure. Okay, I will go for this question. So I think one of the things that I've struggled with personally, and the universities or colleges I have attended, I think have struggled with, or maybe the people I have talked to, you know, at different conferences, I think it is changing now. But this is what I've personally witness is we are not happy about talking about contentious issues. We're not happy about talking about controversial things. We are not comfortable talking about things that are not common among us. We can easily talk about things that unite us, even within the classrooms, in academic settings, conferences and whatnot. But I think this is an area that we can improve. We are improving, but I think we have to focus more on. And also what can be done from a pedagogical point of view. I think when we talk about curricular and co-curricular or extracurricular activities, what we do inside the class and what we do outside the class, for example, volunteering for a nonprofit, or maybe helping with the research that local government is doing, or something that is happening at the society level. So there is a service component and there is an academic component, and I've seen that in different CVs, even in my CV. So I think this has to be interconnected. We have to have more connections with local governments, and this is what I guess we have done with FCCMA, with the Florida City and County Management Association. So mostly the MPAs, when it came to their capstone project, we invited different local governments, what are the issues they're struggling with, and we kind of tried to connect students with those topics, and maybe with other issues that local nonprofits are dealing with. So I think there is a room. The point that I first talked about is to talk about more controversial issues, things that are different among us. And I think we learn more when we talk about things, and we bring different perspective into that. And I'm looking forward to hear more from my colleagues here.
Excellent.
I can go next. I absolutely agree with Abdul in terms of what is being done and what's the current state. I think just to add would be, I think self-reflections in a curriculum design is extremely important, especially because, as Abdul mentioned, like we had in a curriculum design or in just general, like you have internship opportunities, you get to volunteer with community organizations, or you get to work with a public service organization. I think in order for the social justice component to be interconnected back to the public service, it's important to self-reflect and see how are we defining how are we looking at social injustices, or are we looking at it's not necessary that what I consider to be a social injustice might not be what my colleague might consider. So I think it's extremely important to sort of self-reflect and understand how we can, what are the different perspectives around social justice, how would we be able to do it. So I think awareness about it, from not just that, okay, there should be social justice in a workplace or in curriculum design, but more around what kind of social justice, what are the different perspectives that are currently available. And I think the more interdisciplinary that you can go, I think it helps to broaden your perspective as well. Coming from a very personal research, since my research is in the education sector, I think I do look at a lot of the sociology of education and political science literature along with the PA literature. And having that interdisciplinary perspective gives me a better understanding of schools as a public service organizations. The other point that I wanted to mention was, I'm somehow blanking out, but I think, okay, I'm going to stop here. It will come back to me.
Okay, and anytime it does, just go ahead and feel free to just mention it.
Yeah.
I guess I will just follow suit with our order we've been kind of doing here. So I would definitely have to agree that having more open dialogue within the classroom is really, really important, especially for me, because I attend a PWI, predominantly white institution, where majority of the time I'm probably one out of, I don't know how many other students who are either African American or just a minority or a female in general. And so in every space on the University of Cincinnati's campus, I am a minority in some way, shape, or form. So I think having a space in the classroom to have difficult conversations on topics that are very controversial will help us, once we get into the professional world, if we're not already in it, to become more confident and familiar with having conversations where we aren't necessarily like-minded, but we can respect everyone's opinion. And just as someone else stated, we all view social justice from a different viewpoint. And so that will create a space for us to be able to maybe hear some other topics or viewpoints that we didn't even or wouldn't even think of. And I think it's also really important for us to be able to address some of the social equity issues that are even going on within our own campus. So I think for me, that's really important. I know I've been able to kind of share my frustrations with how my specific university has reacted to police brutality in Cincinnati, or some of the issues that occurred on campus during the wake of a lot of racial tension, and how they responded to some of those events. And so I think that is really important to have that space in the classroom so that we can kind of share perspectives and just have an overall just open dialogue.
I definitely agree with everything that's been said so far. I think that, there's so many things, perhaps things that we're not even really thinking about. If we allow ourselves to kind of think creatively about these things, that would really help not only bring social justice to the fore, but create more commitment around it. I think one thing that we definitely need to do, and perhaps this is my own experience, and also just in surveying and looking at different syllabi, things like that, I think we need to assign more theory. I think that more ethical theory and political theory is definitely needed. I think that sometimes when we're kind of still struggling a little bit as a field, and kind of being political science's stepchild. And I think that we really need to start marrying the two and recognizing, how linked those two disciplines are and how they help make sense of governance and different approaches. And I think that would really help kind of substantiate and give purpose in life almost to public service and governance, and also our understandings of social justice and why it's important and urgent. I think, within the curriculum, I think it's really important that we review those and look at, whose voices are we including, whose texts are we assigning, what texts are your students really engaging with? Because I think that by virtue of the books or the texts that we assign, we're really kind of communicating whose voices we value and that we think are important in these conversations. Same as, when you have a guest lecturer, who are you inviting? What kind of research are they doing? What kind of methods are they using? And things of that sort. I think a few of you have already kind of mentioned this too. I think there is merit to assigning, of course, the seminal literature and the canon, but I think we need to be sure to also invite critical interrogation of that and provide that context. So in public affairs, especially at the PhD program, even though I'm guessing at the master's level as well, I don't have an MPA, so I don't know if this is something that's usually talked about, but we always see Wilson 1887 assigned. And I understand the purpose for that. But you can't assign that without also mentioning that Wilson was a raging unapologetic racist, right? We need to situate those meanings and explore historical context. It can't just be one or the other. And frankly, I know that it's challenging and I think sometimes controversial, but I think we also need to see social justice really kind of embedded into faculty's research. And by that, I mean, regardless of your methods or your epistemic approaches, I think that if it's being taught and that faculty member themselves, you know, isn't exploring this in their own research, it just kind of seems dishonest, at least to me, I should say. And I think Abdul spoke to this earlier. I think we really need to like erode this tired and false like dichotomy between positive and normative. It's not only false, but I think it's misleading. And you know, if you are a positivist, you know, we can still count things and still be driven and influenced by normative commitments. I think that dichotomy really puts a strain and is a barrier to what questions can be explored. And more importantly, which of those questions are ultimately funded. And I also think that this, because of that, it relegates people doing this work, doing social justice and equity work, to second-class citizenship, like, you know, within the PA community. I think that social justice is often seen as soft or lacking in rigor, and I think that that's also a problem. And you know, Abdul already spoke to his own experience, you know, saying that he questioned this before even picking a dissertation topic, and I'm sure that that happens for professors as well. And if you're seeking tenure and what, you know, what is going to get you tenure and things like that, you know, we need to be very careful with what we incentivize as well as what we disincentivize. And I think that people really need to use their positions to bring social justice to the fore. So if you're an editor, a journal editor, you know, what are you putting in your calls for papers and symposia? You know, if you're a dean, if you're a part of an academic association, if you're a practitioner, if you're a part of some task force, whatever it is, I think we really need to work to center social justice and equity into that. And into every conversation that we're having, really. And I know that, you know, it's easier said than done, but I think it's possible and within reach. And you know, whether we have a commitment to do it, I think is a different question.
And Heather, there we go, guys. Sorry, I've noticed we had some audio issues, so I'm glad to see you back. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I know it's on my end. So I just wanted to follow on Stephanie's thoughts. And I really think that, you know, in terms of active social justice, we really have to link these fields of economic research, political science, public administration, and you know, how we influence our thinking or epistemology about policy and those policy implications for public administration. And so, you know, I think that there's this, Stephanie touched on this, and I think that, you know, in terms of academia, we need to be able to have this safe space where we hold these uncomfortable conversations about, you know, who the founders of public administration thought are, and go through this group learning process together that, you know, we are evolving and improving within the field, and that it's not an either or idea that we have to embrace, but there's this pluralism of gathering many diverse perspectives into the conversation so that we are all learning this together as we go. And I think, you know, for the University of Montana, and Stephanie touched on this also, the icons and the artifacts of our learning really reflect the commitment of the program. And so, for example, every syllabus that I had in my master's program held a space for a cultural leave policy, as well as a recognition of whose ancestral homeland the University of Montana was on, and just a recognition and an honoring of that to the entire class, so that we could recognize that collectively. I think that those gave me a better sense of belonging in that group. And I would say that, you know, we were really challenged at the University of Montana to think about our concept of in public administration, what is cultural competency, and is that even achievable? And, you know, I think that, you know, some of us came to the conclusion, and there's been some work on this, that you can't achieve cultural competency if you're not from that culture, or you're not embracing that culture for for personal reasons. But you can focus within the larger field of public administration and the bureaucracy with cultural respect, which means being open to learning different ways and being respectful that there are different ways. And so I think that, you know, really challenging our concepts, really challenging our thinking, and holding that safe space for people to, you know, bring different and diverse perspectives is so critical to how we model this in the classroom.
You know, this is a powerful conversation, and just a couple things before we go on to our next question. So Dr. Tia Gaynor is in the audience with this. So, you know, Dr. Gaynor, you know, one of the premier social justice researchers in PA, has done a lot of really great things for DSJ in particular, had fantastic events through a Center for Racial Justice and Truth at the University of Cincinnati, great organization. She reminded us of this article about the Jim Crow policies of Woodrow Wilson, because Woodrow Wilson has come up a few times in this conversation. And it's a fascinating thing, because yeah, you're right. We assign Woodrow Wilson all the time, but Woodrow Wilson reversed Black American progress. He promoted the Ku Klux Klan. He oversaw segregation of the federal workforce. He erased gains for African Americans, in particular Blacks, Reconstruction, and more. And the list goes on. And there are many figures within PA who have promoted racist, white supremacist agendas, and without assigning, at the very least, readings by voices outside this bar to provide these counter narratives, it is such a disservice to all students. And that's just the beginning, is assigning these readings. So does anyone have any follow-ups on that? Because while we're talking, you're also giving us really great ideas about what has to be in the series, having difficult conversations, creating diversity, equity, and inclusion in syllabi and readings. But if anyone has any follow-ups, you know, please do so now. And I'll in the interim, I'll get the next question copied and ready to share. Okay. And also, it looks, I'm just going to post the fourth question right here. We have a couple other things we're going to be sharing in the chat here shortly. And this leads nicely to the next question. How can and should social justice be modeled in the classroom? Again, intentionally broad, so you can approach it however way you want.
Okay. I think continuing our order, I will go first. So I finished my MPA in 2015, and I think one of the best courses in the whole program I took was cultural competency in public administration. And at that point, we were still debating whether this should be a core course in the curriculum or an optional course. And at that time, it was not a core course to get your MPA. And after taking that course, I mean, you take different courses, you attend different classrooms. I think I had that aha moment, which means it just, you know, challenged some of the preconceived notions I had in my mind, and also, you know, challenged me to learn more. So I think that was an interesting learning process for me. And I will also mention that, and I think some of the scholars also talked about this as well, that how often this happened that we get together in one classroom and we leave that class without getting exposed to different culture within that classroom. So even in this panel, you know, we represent different backgrounds, nationalities, ethnicities, and all that. A few suggestions that I have in my mind and I can share when it comes to how we can model social justice in the classroom. I think most of the courses that I have attended, few of them I have taught, are very heavy on theory. And we can always improve, you know, what content, you know, to put there for students to read. But I think we have to provide more chances to students to practice social justice. Some of the classes I've been in, we were assigned documentaries, movies. All of us have heard about the Tuskegee experiment, but some of the documentaries I watched, it just like gave different narratives. So I think that's kind of helpful in terms of how we can model. And also some of the assignments that I gave to my students, one was they were supposed to go and attend public meetings and just write their observations. And I was amazed to see how it changed their minds and the futures the careers they wanted to pursue after seeing some of the injustices they have seen in the courts or maybe other places. So I think there are so many things that we can do, but I think giving more chances to practice social justice to students and bringing that in the classroom and talk more about it, and also bringing external speakers, um, um, that would really help. And I look forward to hear from the rest of the panelists.
Great.
I can go next. I think piggybacking on what Abdul said in terms of like the guest speakers, I think it's very important to sort of root the students to the community that they belong to. I think most MPA programs, if you do like an in-course survey, you'll see that majority of them are actually residents of those particular communities. And I think it's very important that you give them that opportunity to be exposed to the different organizations that are currently there, that are working currently to like try and remove some of the injustices that are happening in their own communities. So I think beyond, there's one aspect is where you want to look at the historical trend. You want to understand where it started from or where is it, why is it happening? But there's also the other one where you need to give both students, faculty, everyone an opportunity to understand what is currently being done, how it is being done, how is it so relevant in today's context. So I think that is definitely one aspect. And I think it's also important for international students. Most MPA programs have international students, and I think there is a lot of unlearning that can happen if they are also part of these workshops or internships or volunteering experience with the community where they are currently residing. I think when international students come, they have a certain, you could say, stereotype. They have a certain context in which they look at the US social injustices or what is currently happening politically. And I think working with the organization and getting that hands-on learning experience is equally important for international students, especially I think both ways. One, if they're going back to their home country, it's important for them to draw the parallels between the US context and their home country context to understand what best practices might be working best in US that can be actually adapted in their own country context, but where also they're differing, where it wouldn't actually work and what else can be done. Second, if international students decide to stay back, they decide to continue their education or continue to work in a US context, I think in those situations also, it's equally important that they get that hands-on experience so that they are able to understand what it means to be, what are the different cultures that are around them and how do they work alongside with the rest of them. Secondly, I think the other thing that needs to be really thought about would be how, I think I go back to how can you show social injustices in a classroom? And that one aspect, like Abdul has already mentioned, and even Stephanie mentioned previously, is to really delve deeper into the theoretical perspectives, but also with respect to methodology. I think even if you're looking at quantitative methodology, there is a way to look at the data, or there is a way to show the data. This is from, I was teaching an MPA course on GIS, and I only had 7 students, so it was more in-depth in learning. But I asked them, I was like, what is your background? What kind of data sets are you interested in? They were all interested to understand, because they were all belonging to Newark or in New Jersey. They wanted to know how can we look at gentrification on a map? How are we able to see a change in, let's say, their own counties? They wanted to look at the data set. So I think giving them access to data sets, trying to show them, okay, there is data that actually shows, and not just data that is available, that you can just see in some national dashboards, but like looking at more county level data or more zip code. I think trying to figure out different ways through data also is equally important to show where social injustice is actually happening and where it's not.
Great points.
Definitely can agree with the statements that have been shared so far. For me, when I think about social justice or social equity being discussed in the classroom. I see it as being more than just being discussed in an elective course, or it's being more than just being discussed in a cultural competency course. I think that social justice and social equity needs to be ingrained in every last course that is a part of the MPA or PA, whatever program you're in. It needs to be ingrained in every aspect of that educational format. And luckily, that is something I have had the experience of being, sitting in a space where my budgeting course, we of course learned about the ins and outs of finances and budgeting, but we also had a space where we talked about some of the unintentional and intentional consequences of public budgets and how that affects and oppresses marginalized communities. And so I think that when we talk about social justice, it shouldn't be like in addition to the rest of our required courses in the program. It should definitely be like involved in every class that you need to take, versus than just being seen as like this one check mark, like, okay, you took this course and so now you know all about cultural competency or social justice. Like, it needs to be discussed all the time so that it's something that we have like ingrained in our brains, instead of we just take this course and then it's out of our minds for the rest of the program.
Excellent points.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. In thinking of this question, I feel like sometimes there's certain things that we feel like, are obvious or we take for granted. But I think one of the most important things that we can do, particularly as educators, is when it comes to social justice is being honest, frankly. I think we owe students the truth. And I think that oftentimes there's a fear of editorializing or feeling like we're indoctrinating students or interpolating our own biases and inclinations, but that's going to happen anyway. And I think we really need to own the truth, and I think we need to tell the truth. I think we need to really stop shirking our responsibility as educators to talk about these difficult conversations about white supremacy and about racism and about capitalism and about imperialism. I think we need to talk about those aspects of it and how they're rooted and reinforced by, through law and policy. And I know that oftentimes it can be, at least for me, it's, overwhelming or, defeating, but I think that we can't just surrender to these harsh realities. I think that's what encourages stagnance. I think Eunique talked about, the field being stagnant earlier. I think we really need to equip students with these understandings and cultivating a culture of courage and a culture of questioning and a lot of respect for counter narratives, which I think speaks to Sean's question earlier. And I think Heather spoke to this too, of, how do we, it can't be that either or. I think we need to explore, different narratives and different funds of knowledge. And I think everybody already kind of spoke to, the nexus between research and practice. And I think also with community engagement, I think we really need to discuss the realities of community needs in our classrooms, because I think often, within the academy, we tend to be detached or, kind of have these surface level analysis or understandings of what issues people are struggling with and the realities of community needs. So I think we really need to center the community and position community members as thought leaders, and share different avenues for engaging with social justice. I think some folks were talking about internships or different opportunities like that, like outside of the academy and outside of even formal institutions. I think we need to honor that history of how we've gotten change in this country, and it hasn't always been through some kind of constitutional amendment or whatever policy. And many times it's been through revolution and other means. I think beyond that, I think we also need to acknowledge, who is or isn't in the room. in our classrooms and acknowledge those different perspectives that students are bringing, and also like highlight those funds of knowledge, that there isn't only one way of knowing things. And Heather spoke to that, our epistemology. I think we need to, be more adaptive to different ways of understandings and culturally relevant understandings and approaches. And I think, this is talked about a lot in K-12 pedagogy, but I think even in higher ed, I think we really need to position students as meaning makers. How do we encourage critical interrogation and invite students to ask more of those why questions? In some ways, it's kind of an expectation, especially for PhD students. That's kind of just kind of inherent to our work. But I really think that we need to be very dissatisfied with our students just regurgitating what others have said or what the literature says. In literature reviews, it's kind of like what we do. But I think beyond that, we need to really invite students to question the whole polity, and we need to explore again that infrastructure in these institutions and why are things the way that they are, rather than surveying of the way things like currently are. I think that really, if we were to have a little bit more courage and more like being more willing to take these risks, I think that we can really create a completely different framework of social justice and ways of approaching it.
So this is Heather, and I would just echo, what I've heard throughout the answers to this particular question. I think that we need to embed social justice learning throughout each of the core learnings that are required of students. And I also think that we need to try to figure out a way where our optional courses are not cannibalizing each other or competing against each other for students' time and attention. And I know that, to some extent that's balancing something that's somewhat impossible, but I know in my own experience, did I want to learn about, gender equity in public administration, or was it more important that I took a course on federal Indian law to better understand the work that I wanted to do after I graduated from the program? And so I just think that creating intentional opportunities to weave social justice and equity and representativeness concepts and examples and learning opportunities throughout all of the curriculum, the required curriculum, is really critically important. And I would also say that this is, outside of the classroom. The center is getting ready to publish a paper on Native student financial inclusion, or the affordability of higher education, and the completion of degree programs by Native American students. And there is so much in terms of externalities that Native students are facing, that they end up leaving school with a lot of debt, without a degree. And I think that as institutions, we need to be more intentional about creating pathways to completion that, we're really looking at the cost of inclusion. And if you think about, like structural racism or financial racism, it is, being a professional and having a good paying job is a pay to play opportunity. And we need to really start to think about how within our institutions do we create these opportunities for these brilliant minds to come to bear on professions and on academia, even after and beyond, their doctoral work or their master's degree. So I would say, we need to expand that question to institutionally, how do we address social justice, and how do we get more, women, minorities, people of color, different political and ethnic statuses, how do we get them in places of decision making? So, yeah, there's me turning the question on its head. Thank you.
No, I mean that is fantastic, and one of the things I think this really nicely goes into is that we've received just a wealth of great questions on the form. Everyone has asked us to ask it on their behalf, and so we did have one more question. We got some great answers. This last question that provided some answers. Last questions we were going to ask, but this question we'd like to ask from one of the audience members, Dr. James Wright II, who's also been on a few DSJ webinars. So thank you, Dr. Wright. I think nicely helps really highlights some of these topics that we've been talking about, and also really goes along with this final question we were going to ask, but we really wanted to ask this one. So here is Dr. Wright's question. What are some visible actions faculty and departments should take to help promote a social justice framework for students in MPA and PhD programs? And while you're thinking, I would just like to draw your attention to the comment just right above us. Dr. Stacy Zavataro was here. She had to step out. She's among the many things she does in the field, she's also the editor-in-chief of Administrative Theory and Praxis, and she shared this link with me. So Dr. Peter Federman is putting together a series of book reviews about critical perspectives on key works. So if anyone here is interested in this, I would really encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. It'd be great. So I'm going to be quiet. Do any of our panelists have any thoughts about Dr. Wright's question? It was a great question. Abdul, are you on?
Yeah,
there you go. Okay, we're good.
Thank you. Sure. I mean, it's a wonderful question. Thank you for the question. I think what comes to my mind directly is just providing safe spaces for students. That is number one, where they can talk about who they are, what they represent. And I think ensuring they don't fundamentally have to agree with things, talked about in the class if there is something they fundamentally disagree with. And I think more importantly, that would help would be providing, incentives, incentivizing students, encouraging, motivating students if they're doing work on social justice. And I think that also goes with for scholars as well. And in my experience, I think I have not met a single student who does not care about changing the world for the better. I think if we provide more opportunities to students in which they can interact with their local governments, nonprofits, or just bridging that gap between academia and practice, that will be really helpful. But also on top of like incentivizing and motivating students.
I think one visible action would be in terms of the curriculum design and the syllabus. I think having some of the work of scholars, women of color, international perspectives, I think those are really important. I don't know who knows about it or doesn't, but I found this interesting tool called the Gender Balance Assessment Tool by Professor Jane Summer from University of Minnesota, where you can actually just add your bibliography in it, and it actually tells you how many women scholars you have cited in your bibliography versus how many is things. So it's a very interesting tool, which I can definitely share over here. I think the second is more in terms of having a core curriculum built around social justice. I think instead of social justice and talking about social justice in silos through different courses, you can talk about in HR policies through employment laws and policies. You might be able to talk about it in budgeting systems through looking at distributional equity. I think it's more important to have more of a foundational course around social justice that can really build into then a lot of these elective courses around. And I think that also gives students, whether they're an undergrad or MPA program, to really look at it from a social equity lens as they start the MPA program from, the foundation courses to their capstone, the entire process. I think it's important that they have the information and the awareness that there is a social justice lens that they can utilize from start to end during the entire MPA program. And I think finally, which I think I've a lot of the panelists already resonate, and I think I've mentioned before, is to tie it back to the community organizations and to the community. I think that is extremely important because most of the students in an MPA program are residents of that community. And I think it would be the most beneficial for them to get an understanding from theory to practice as to what is actually happening, and to go back and self-reflect whether what is being done in practice is being resonated in theory as well.
I would definitely have to echo that shaping curriculum is one of the things that I think faculty and departments could do that would be visible to help promote a social justice framework. So prior to me attending the University of Cincinnati's MPA-SJ program, I was enrolled in a different program, and I actually transferred over to UC because the curriculum that I was receiving at the in the other program was very surface level. It was very, I mean, the speakers that they brought in, they worked for organizations that had X amount of millions of dollars for a budget. I mean, they were so beyond what I wanted to personally get out of the program. So that's what made me switch over. And I think it's probably been the best academic decision I've made in my life. So within the MPA-SJ program, every core course that I've taken has had a overall frame of assisting some type of community organization in Cincinnati. So in addition to our required text that we read and discuss in class, we have worked side by side with a community organization, helping them address an issue that they have of their choice or something that they need help with. And I think that that really speaks to, you know, what PA is, right? Like, we're going to be going into this field where we're working with the public, we're assisting the public. So not only does involving some type of community engagement where you're not just as a student typing up a research paper and then turning it in like, okay, I've done this deep dive about this organization or this community and I found X, Y, and Z, but I'm actually attending the meetings. We're hosting town halls, and I know COVID got in the way of a lot of some of the like community work that we plan to do, but it has been such a refreshing experience for me to be involved in a program where they recognize community involvement as one of the most critical and impactful pieces to PA. And so I think that if you really want to force your students out of their comfort zone, like, you have to get involved in the community. Like, that's the only way to really do it, and acknowledge some of those things that are going on in organizations or just right outside the university. I know, you know, most universities are really nice and they're well put together, and then right across the street or down the street, you have so many different social equity issues, and you have them on campus as well. And so I think that if faculty and departments really wanted to take social justice or social equity, you know, seriously in their programming, that they need to do more involvement with the community and have more intentional conversations about what equity or social equity look like on their campus.
Yeah, I think these are all great points. Echo all of it as well, and the importance for that engaged scholarship, and you know, an acknowledgement of the communities that we're in. Like in CU Denver, for example, I think there needs to be a lot more acknowledgement of, you know, the communities that we've displaced for our campus to even be where it is, and that happens so often. It's like the story of so many different campuses across the U.S. But, you know, I think, you know, a lot of folks have already kind of talked about interpolating, you know, social justice into the curriculum. So I don't want to talk too much more about that. The only thing I want to say is that, like, I do think it's important for that to be a part of, you know, your weekly assignments or readings. Like, rather than saying, okay, we'll talk about social justice in week 8, it's like, how do you embed some kind of social justice text into you know, whatever the theme is for that class or for that week. I think that would be really important. I think for a lot of faculty, they tend to be part of recruiting students as well as admitting students in that process. Me coming in from my higher ed, with my higher ed hat, I think it's also important, you know, for us to have really holistic approaches to admissions and, you know, go beyond the, you know, the GPAs and the GREs. And I think that right now we're in that state of reckoning with a lot of programs, you know, just kind of removing the GRE as a requirement due to COVID. But I'm very curious of what will happen, you know, once COVID is over, and you know, what kind of staying power that has. But I really think that that's important for the kinds of students that we get into the classroom, given you know, the history and racism of those standardized tests. I think we also need to ask faculty to, Dr. James' question is, you know, incorporating and discussing current events. I was glad that the moment we started, Sean, Dr. McCallis spoke about, you know, the insurrection in the White House. I feel like we can't just ignore those things that are happening right around us, but I think that we really need to, even if it's maybe not what we plan to talk about for that day in that class, I think we need to recognize what's happening and how it's affecting students, and how we can, you know, relate that back to the literature. I think also in the mission statement of departments, I think that's what the University of Cincinnati does really well, that the moment that you go to that website, you know, ultimately like what their mission and vision is. And I think that that's important in the sense of message to students about what the department, you know, what kind of culture there is and what they find important. And for faculty, I think it's really important also to position yourself as a learner within the classroom, to empower your students, and essentially show that you have as much to learn from your students and they have to learn from you. And you know, having that flexibility, which I know is really difficult, but having the flexibility to really co-create your courses, right? So, you know, what may work for a certain cohort, you know, maybe just lecturing may not work for another cohort or a classroom of students. So allowing and incorporating feedback from your students and you know, about the structure of the class, what's being discussed and things of that sort, I think is also really important. And you know, a great way of really being able to promote social justice in PA programs.
Excellent.
Sure. So this is Heather, and you know, just to kind of weigh in on that last point of, you know, what are the visible actions that faculty and departments should take to help promote social justice framework for students? And I think, you know, from my own personal experience, it was that my supervisor, or my advisor, and my professors, and the dean of my particular program would not let me fail. And through COVID, with many competing priorities, there were plenty of opportunities to not pick back up and just say this is too hard. And I think that that's really important when you think about the inclusion of minorities and women and LGBTQ and, you know, people of different perspectives really rounding out this field of public administration to be more representative and equitable, that there are oftentimes no pathways that have already been laid for this particular student or this particular experience to know how to be successful. And so, you know, similar to Eunique, I am a first generation college graduate in my family. You know, my dad's a plumber, my mom was a secretary. They know nothing about you know, my college experience or how it can be difficult or how to navigate some of the institutional barriers and structural barriers that are out there to be a student and to become a professional and to actualize success. And so I just think that, you know, having come from probably a smaller MPA program, I had that direct touch with my professors and you know, with the dean of my school. And so as many times as I wanted to, you know, just say this is too much or I'm fine right where I'm at right now, they really invested in me personally. And I just, I hope that that is, you know, something that can be, or that is done at other schools as well. So yeah, I just think that realizing that for many people, if we're expanding this field of public administration to be more inclusive and representative, that we need to think about, you know, there is no rubber meets the road for many of these students. And so they really need to be held and cultivated through that space, as you know, as frustrating as that may be sometimes for the professors and the faculty and the departments and staff. So yeah, and I would just say a huge thank you for that to my school for doing that for me, because it made a difference of what I'm doing now and the influence that I can then have on policy and decision making.
This was a really, really powerful discussion. I mean, I'm really so glad why we're recording this, because every single thing that every one of the panelists have said have provided actionable, ideal things that really need to happen, whether at the individual level, the school level, the programmatic level, the disciplinary level, and so forth. I'd also like to share something that Meril Antony, she kindly shared this important syllabus tool, the Gender Balance Assessment Tool, GBAT. So you can go ahead and check that out right there. And we actually are at time. We had several more questions. We could probably go for another 3 hours or more. I mean, that's a good thing. This was really a fantastic discussion. We really needed this discussion, and this discussion highlights that we can, should, and must center social justice throughout PA curriculum in multiple ways. And thank you to our 5 amazing panelists: Meril Antony, Rutgers University, Newark; Eunique Avery of the University of Cincinnati; Stephanie Puello of the University of Colorado, Denver; Abdul of Florida International University; and Heather Sobrepena of the University of Montana. We hope to announce more webinars in this series soon, but we definitely have some ideas about what we need to do. And let's just all remember as we go forward, it's our duty to query, dismantle, interrogate unjust systems, and to create systems that promote justice for all. Earlier, we talked about public service. I think we can all agree there's no true public service without it being socially just. And when we do all of these things, public services can live to their highest potential and PA's highest potential, namely to improve lives. So thank you all for attending. Thank you to our panelists. I hope to have a recording ready for review. And then once we get permission from the panelists, we will get this posted. And I hope every MPA, DPA, and PhD program director out there watches this, because it was powerful, absolutely powerful. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you for everyone who attended.